happening, with the renewed mandate of Jeremy Corbyn, that it would be worthwhile, some 40 years after the post-war Keynesian consensus was junked by James Callaghan at the Labour Party conference in 1976, to re-examine the issues that had been explored in the alternative economic strategy of the 1970s, and what an alternative economic strategy, rather different from what's gone on in the last 30-odd years, could be in the United Kingdom for the Labour Party. And as we were doing it, we very quickly were reminded that it is the 80th anniversary of the publication of the General Theory, and the 70th anniversary of the death of Lord Keynes. And we wanted, before the end of the year, at the time when people feel they could actually maybe take a morning off and have a pause, to think about the legacy of the General Theory, what it means in the contemporary context. Most of us have been very badly shaken by the Great Recession. Many of us who are very confident in our ideas, I think, have actually been given pause for thought, very much in the way that the Great Depression so shook Maynard Keynes's generation of thinkers and policymakers. And we thought we should actually take this opportunity to examine the General Theory and its legacy in that context. But we're also mindful of the fact that Maynard Keynes was a most remarkable personage. And we wanted to think of him as a public figure, his contribution to public life. And we also wanted to consider not just his role in the arts, but his role as an investor. He was a very interesting financial market speculator, and I'm very pleased that in the end I think he was a rather successful one, rather than some of the problems that his contemporary Irving Fisher encountered when he borrowed a lot on margin and it all went wrong and his house had to be bought by Yale University and bail him out. So we've tried to construct today where we won't be able to do justice to all of Keynes' life. Say, for example, we haven't really got a section trying to look at the international dimension of his contribution in shaping the Bretton Woods debate and the Bretton Woods institutions. We probably could spend the whole morning just dealing with the economic consequences of the peace, or the economic consequences of Mr. Churchill. And I'm very mindful that one thing that we're not going to be exploring in any sort of elaborate detail as part of a sort of general plan, although I'm sure it will come up, is Keynes's own work as a mathematician. Keynes, of course, came from an extremely mathematically competent household. His father wrote a book on formal logic, a book that was very influential in shaping many of the aspects of research of Lewis Carroll. His book on symbolic logic, published in 1896, actually drew on some of the problems that had been set by Keynes's father. And of course he did a lot of work on probability, did a lot of work on index numbers, although I think it's fair to say it was really Fisher who actually made the progress on indices, which we now draw on much more. But Keynes had serious reservations about using mathematics and what he called overly complex mathematical apparatus and defective data. And you've only got to think of that very interesting lecture that Paul Omerod gave in New York earlier this autumn to actually think again about those things. And when you rake through the General Theory and when you rake through Lord Stagelski's great biography, one is reminded of the war he actually waged against some poor statistician for many years. So unfortunately we can't really go there, but I think we have to acknowledge that he was an interesting economist who was unusually mathematically gifted, although he slightly set that aside. Now, to kick us off, we're very lucky. We've got two old friends of mine. I know many of the people here, and if I don't know them, I know their wives even better. So Pam Meadows, the Mrs. Omerod, was a great mate of mine at the Department of Employment for many years. We're still closely in touch, and professionally over many years have done a lot together, and she's a great friend. It's very good that Paul is going to help us this morning. And Lord Macpherson, who I think I've known for almost 30 years now, and the former head of the Treasury, who's thought a lot about this over many years, and I know has been very good at actually helping people wanting to put these kind of events on elsewhere this year, is going to kick us off with an overview of the whole story, and then Paul will respond to it, and we'll open it up for discussion. Now, we've got a lot of knowledge, a lot of people who are interested, and I hope that we're not so big that we can't have a bit of a dialogue and a discussion. We've got a lot to get through. Jonathan DuPont, who's done a lot to put this together, is going to be the clock watcher and bully. If I end up being a failure, he's going to sort of clock me. So if we kick off with Nick.
Thank you very much. Almost fell down the step, but very good to be here in Great George Street. Treasury across the road, which I left on the 31st of March. Actually reminds me of a time, I think it was in the late 90s, where Joe Rice and I, it's good to see you Joe here, spent some time trying to identify which room Keynes lived in the Treasury. We consulted various ancient officials, and I think Joe managed to reduce it to a short list of 2 rooms in the end. And I think thereafter we just asserted that one of them was Keynes's room, but sadly no one could quite remember. But it's very good to be here. I'm not going to read out a massively long speech. I've got one, but actually I do think this is a good time to be celebrating, the Keynes, the man of ideas, Keynes, the man of action, and also actually Keynes, the man of culture. And looking, it is 80 years since the general theory was published, and I do commend it as a book to read. Some bits of it are quite heavy going, and some of the language if you're a modern economist, don't quite tune into immediately. But it is a good example of how you can write a serious economics textbook without producing hundreds of lines of squiggly equations and full of integration signs and differentiation. Not that I've got anything against those things, they're very important, but economics in my view goes beyond simple mathematics, and Keynes's ability to incorporate other disciplines, history, psychology and so on, is really important. Why is Keynes interesting? Great thinker, but also a man who was prepared to put theory into practice. He was part of Lloyd George's team in the run-up to war in 1914, who averted a major banking crisis. He worked again in the Treasury during the Second World War, and I think that he was instrumental in ensuring that the Western democracies won the peace after the Second World War in the way they failed after 1918. And the Bretton Woods institutions, which he was the main architect of, have stood the test of time in an extraordinary way, even if the system of fixed exchange rates haven't. But Keynes is someone who's very difficult to pin down. In one sense he was a man of his time, the chronic under-demand of the interwar period. But the other reason is that his ideas were continually evolving. In many ways he was and is a paradox. This was a free market liberal who in the 1930s was happy to advocate protection. The general theory itself, as I say, I think is a masterpiece. It put macroeconomic policy and analysis firmly on the map. Keynes's insights into expectations, uncertainty, and the operation of markets, I think, is remarkable. And his description of the stock market in chapter 12, I would commend to anybody. Only last week, actually, I was in a hedge fund just up the road from here, as one is, I was actually struck because I knew I was coming to this event, that how many quotes from Keynes were on the wall, and I started photographing them in the hope that they might help me here. I'm not going to read them all out, but the one which I like best actually is from his metaphor of the beauty contest when it comes to stock selection, and you'll recall that this was a reference to sort of competitions you had in the 1930s newspapers, where the trick wasn't to choose the most beautiful woman. It was actually to choose whom everybody else thought was the most beautiful woman. But the quote on the hedge fund wall was, "It's not a case of choosing those faces that to the best of one's judgment are really the prettiest, nor even those that average opinion genuinely thinks the prettiest. We've reached the third degree where we devote our intelligences to anticipating what average opinion expects the average opinion to be, and there are some, I believe, who practice the fourth, fifth, and higher degrees." And as Warwick says, Keynes was an enthusiastic investor who was prepared to put his money where his mouth was. And I know that from first-hand experience because my grandfather was Keynes' stockbroker, and I grew up with many stories of him. And my father, who also worked in the same stockbroking firm, regrets that when they moved into the new stock exchange tower in the early 1970s, a whole lot of papers were destroyed, which would, I think, be of extraordinary interest. The other main thing about general theory is it does provide much, though not all, of the basis for what came to be known as Keynesianism, a view that government could not just manage demand, but seek to smooth the operation of the trade cycle through fiscal policy. Whether Keynes himself would have supported this sort of new Keynesian post-war approach had he lived, we'll never know. The general theory was focused on addressing persistent depression. Chapter 22, Notes on the Trade Cycle, is almost an afterthought. It was Hicks, Mead, and others who sought to operationalise Keynesianism. And here, I would like to take issue with some of the blurb which was circulated by the excellent Policy Exchange to the effect that we are all Keynesians now. Of course, demand management can make a difference. As an official, I supported Alistair Darling's loosening of policy in 2008 and the subsequent tightening in 2009-10. And I also thought George Osborne, was right to use the automatic stabilisers to support demand and not pursue his fiscal rules at any price when the economy slowed in 2011-12. For my part, and I can say this now, I'm no longer in the pay of the government, I'm rather more ambivalent about Mr. Hammond's recent loosening of policy. At a time when the economy is at full employment and monetary policy is eye-wateringly loose, I regret that the government is no longer seeking to reach budget balance in the foreseeable future. If you're going to use fiscal policy to support demand, I think it's far better to do it from a position of strength when debt is low rather than when it's high and rising. And at a time like now when debt is getting towards that sort of red light zone of 100% of GDP, it is really interesting that public debt has been rising year by year now for about, for certainly over a decade, possibly 15 years, and it's always, the turning point's always deferred. And the reason I worry about these things is it just makes you vulnerable to one of those inflection points you occasionally run into in economic policy, because as Keynes himself observed, economies do not move in straight lines. You just are very vulnerable to a change in the interest rate climate. And although the debt interest bill now is very low because of the slightly manufactured low interest environment, that we cannot assume that's going to go on forever. The other thing which I think is worth also, if you're trying to sort of think through whether we should use fiscal policy to support demand, is Keynes was writing at a time when the labour market actually was far less flexible than it is now. And the extraordinary thing which successive governments have achieved in Britain, really since the 1980s, both through improving work incentives, reforming industrial relations legislation, pursuing more active labour market measures, is that our labour market now is one of the most flexible and efficient there is. There's one reason why unemployment peaked at a lower level in the 1990s recession compared to the 1980s one, and why it peaked at a much lower level, even though we had really quite a severe recession in 2009. And the capacity of real wages to adjust in Britain now to ensure that the labour market clears is on a totally different level than it was on the 1930s, because Keynes's case for public works then was based on his view that nominal and hence real wages could not adjust enough, not least because of the strength of the trades union movement. The other point I would make is that certainly over my working life, I think there's been a persistent tendency to mistake structural weakness for cyclical weakness. As I said earlier, Keynes was writing at a time of chronically low demand, but it's not at all clear that the recent experience, certainly in the UK, fits that description. Indeed, I would argue the British consumer is alive and well and still retains, along with the politicians they elect, a chronic tendency to overconsume. Employment is at a record level. Inflation may be below target, but it is now rising. None of these indicators, at least to me, suggest signs of chronic lack of demand, and I doubt Keynes would have seen them as such either. The plain fact is, and this is the challenge I think for policymakers, is that growth of productive potential in the UK and to a degree in the US has slowed significantly since the financial crisis. But throughout this period, Keynesians have been arguing that the same old prescription, more stimulus and a higher deficit. And the reality is, and again I don't want to sound too much like the classic purveyor of the Treasury view, there is this extraordinary tendency towards asymmetry. For most of the post-war period, governments found it much easier to lower interest rates than to increase them. They found it easier to increase the deficit rather than to try and close the deficit, which perhaps explains why we had a persistent tendency to have higher inflation and indeed higher deficits. But Bank of England independence has largely solved the former problem. I'm a great fan of the new independent Office for Budgetary Responsibility. It does mean that the budget process now is far more sensible and efficient. Gone are the days where you have to sit around in number 10 Downing Street arguing with the Prime Minister who wanted to fix the forecast as a way of dealing with the deficit. But the fact is, even with the OBR, fiscal policy hasn't been contracted out, and actually it shouldn't be contracted out. Another point I'd just throw in, Keynesian policy is always going to be more effective in a relatively closed economy. It's no wonder that I think the United States, and indeed my friend Dr. Carney, who comes from North America, is more attached to the big increase in demand to support employment. The problem with the UK is we are a very open economy, and actually, as Carney himself pointed out, you can't always rely on the kindness of strangers to help solve our persistent balance of payments problems. That led Keynes to argue in the 1930s for protection, and when I was growing up, Wynne Godley and the New Cambridge School were arguing for import controls. Now, Brexit may make protection possible again. It may even make it inevitable, but it may just be the Gladstonian liberal in me. I would set a very high bar indeed before advocating any protection. You only have to look at the famous Kindleberger spider diagram of what happened to world demand when protection was introduced in the 1930s. Now, I'm all for spending money on infrastructure, the more so if we can finance it through lower public consumption. If we spent just a little less money on the well-off old folk, we actually have a bit more money to invest in the economy. Personally, I welcome the Infrastructure Commission. I think it could help create a more sensible programme of public investment. But the other point I would make, and this is not about chronic demand shortage, this is about trying to manage the cycle, is that it's very difficult just to turn on and turn off infrastructure spending, especially with our modern sort of planning regimes and so on. It takes a very long time to get infrastructure spending going. Now, Keynes suggested in chapter 10 of the General Theory that the Treasury fill old bottles with banknotes, bury them in disused coal mines, which are then filled up to surface with town rubbish. And then we should leave it to private enterprise to dig them up. And it's a nice idea, but strangely it hasn't quite caught on. But the serious point is that lead times on public investment are long and variable. So that tends to lead the modern Keynesian into arguments for either changing tax rates or increasing current spending. Both perfectly respectable ideas, but again, very difficult to pull off quickly. Changing national insurance, which is this obvious tax to, which actually might be a sensible tax to change at short-term notice, takes a good 6 months. So then you fall back on VAT, which Alistair Darling did in 2008, and that's fine up to a point. But actually, I would argue, and again, it's why I come back to the importance of the supply side. Actually, it's far more important to use a tax to have a sort of create a degree of certainty in a tax system, rather than endlessly tinkering with rates in the hope of supporting demand. Current spending, the problem about current spending, it's all entitlements. It's either entitlements of social security or it's public sector wages or it's wider transfer payments. And again, those are all very easy to increase. But you only have to look at recent problems the government's had in paring back the so-called universal credit to realise, once you start spending money on these things, it's very difficult to pull it back. And anyway, actually, public spending is far better. One of the great successes, I think, since inflation came down, is that public spending is planned over a 4 to 5 year period. That gives far more certainty to public sector managers. And again, just messing about at the margins with spending, I think, just increases economic efficiency. The other thing I would say is just at times, if you're going to follow modern Keynesian policy to its natural conclusion, just the orders of magnitude you'd have to change demand by. If you look at the extent to which either the private sector savings ratio varies year by year, or the extent to which output diverges from trend, you can end up concluding that you've got to really have massive interventions. I think, on the face of it, since 1990, outputs diverged from trend by up to 4%. Had, using OBR multipliers, if you actually want to address that, at those points, the scale of the intervention would be something like 100 to 250 billion pounds. Now, coming back to my efficiency argument, it's quite difficult to think of things you'd want to spend 100 to 250 billion pounds on by next week. And more to the point, I think interventions of that scale would tend to unsettle the market. And I still, in some ways, agree with that rather extraordinary Chancellor Nigel Lawson that actually there are some benefits in having a trade cycle in the Schumpeterian sense. And one of the problems I think we've had since the crisis is so intent have governments been in supporting activity at any price, we've kept really quite a lot of businesses afloat, which in terms of broader economic efficiency, we'd be much better off letting them go out of business. So really, to begin to wrap up this sort of these slightly rambling observations, I think in extremis, it is reasonable for the government to seek to support demand through fiscal policy, but when it comes to things like banking crises, I wouldn't start there. If you have a banking crisis where credit becomes impaired, it's far better to treat the symptoms rather than the disease. influencing through liquidity, credit support schemes. And I think looking back on the last 10 years, although the authorities were perhaps slightly slow to respond to some of those challenges, I don't want to reopen some of the tensions between the Treasury and the Bank of England in 2008. Actually, once the banking crisis really got going, I do think the Bank of England responded very well, and targeting liquidity, targeting credit, I think is more effective than more generalised increases in demand. And at times like this, and I don't think Keynes would have disagreed, it becomes more and more important than ever that we focus on the supply side of the equation as much as demand. Governments always claim that they're doing something about growth, and actually latterly, when I was working at Treasury, we seem to have a new growth strategy every year. And that's good, you know, I'm in favour of thinking about these things, but it does actually require, if you actually want to affect the supply side, it does require a bit of persistence, continuity, and consistency. And I'm glad, you know, infrastructure has come up the agenda. I think governments have done really good things around competition on the whole. They've even been good at supporting innovation in the science sector. The thing which I think we still have failed really to address is the issue of education and skills. And that, to me, if you want to increase Britain's growth rate, is far more important than short-term increases in demand. But coming back to the general theory, actually, the general theory is about a hell of a lot more than the sterile issue of what you do year by year on fiscal policy. And I think, you know, what the authorities have done in Britain in recent years actually goes very much with the grain of what Keynes was saying on competition, liquidity, credit, and labour. So I'd like to think that Keynes, who perhaps understood markets better than any leading economist, would have broadly approved of what, you know, the Treasury over the road has been doing since 2008. And that is all I have to say.
Yeah, thank you very much. Paul Omerod.
Well, thank you very much for it. I agree with a great deal of what's been said, but I'd like just to focus here on two concepts in the general theory, the multiplier and animal spirits. And somebody's not listening at the back. Is my microphone switched on?
It should be, but it appears to be very...
Somebody can't hear at the back, is that okay? But anyway, so I'm going to talk about the multiplier and animal spirits. Now, of course, Keynes was a gentleman, and he eschewed...
I'm not sure, just double check. Right at the back, can you hear nice and clearly or not?
Can you raise the microphone?
Yeah.
I'll use the one on the lectern. If you speak now, it should work. Sorry.
It wasn't switched on. I think that was a problem. So I'll start. So I'm going to talk about the multiplier and animal spirits, which phase, because Keynes was a gentleman, and he eschewed vulgar empirical analysis, but he did, in the general theory, hazard that the multiplier was between 2 and 3. Now, if it's so big, it's a no-brainer in a recessionary situation. Could it have that value? Well, if we take the basic national income identity, you know, Y equals C plus G plus I plus net trade, and have some very simple behavioural equations with a low marginal propensity to save, a low marginal propensity to tax, and, in terms of remarks on a closed economy, a low marginal propensity to import, yes, we could do, and if there are no other equations in the model. But it is now 80 years since the general theory, or rather 70 years since Larry Klein in America started to build econometric models to try to estimate the multiplier, And the economics profession does not have a consensus about the size of the multiplier. E equals mc squared, but we don't know whether C is 0 or 300,000. So much for another general theory. The problem is we don't know what the multiplier is. The very first article I ever published in the National Institute of Economic Review 40 years ago, when for the first time we did a systematic comparison of the Treasury, the London Business School, the National Institute model, what the size of the multiplier was. The one thing we do know is that it's low. It's less than 2, definitely. Then we thought it might be between 0.5 and 1.2. And things haven't really changed. There's a survey in the Journal of Economic Literature by Ramey in 2011 of American estimates of the multiplier using conventional Keynesian models. It's a less open economy, so the multiplier will be higher, and there the range is 0.8 to 1.5. But of course there are many economists, and we can readily construct scenarios in which it could be 0, because in the general theory Keynes attaches a great deal of importance to the long-term rate of interest. So a fiscal expansion when long-term interest rates stay at 2 to 2.5% is one thing, and a fiscal expansion when the markets take fright at the increase in the deficit and interest rates rise to 6 is a different one. And in these circumstances we can readily see that the multiplier may indeed be 0. And the problem in trying to estimate the multiplier is that the narrative with which markets have received successive episodes of fiscal expansion and contraction differ. And so the long-term rate of interest differs, the narrative differs, the sentiment differs, which is going to bring me into animal spirits. But just one interpolation here, that if we're trying to smooth the economy, we have to be able to forecast it. Now, the survey of professional forecasters in the US has a certain averages of the surveys going back to 1968. And 3 quarters ahead, 9 months ahead, the average of professional forecasters in the US over a 50-year period have never predicted a negative growth rate 3 quarters ahead, even though there have been 27 such episodes. So if you're going to use it for smoothing but can't predict a recession, it's useless in that particular sense. But I might observe, in fact, in the longer term, going back to the supply side idea, that if you look at the data since 1870 in the US, in the UK and in Germany, the long-term unemployment rate is about 5%, which is a close approximation to full employment. So maybe in the long run, these economies do have equilibrating properties. But let me think about animal spirits. And I've read the general theory, it's very elegant, it's very difficult to understand in modern terms. So let me translate it into modern terminology. Animal spirits can be thought of as the diffusion of sentiment or narratives across a network. That's what's going on. We've got a group of agents. They're forming their sentiment about the future, which will influence their spending decisions, investment decisions, and narrative spreads. Is it pessimistic or is it optimistic? That's what he's really talking about. He talks about the uncontrollable and disobedient psychology of the business world, waves of irrational psychology, and sentiment being generated as the outcome of mass psychology of a large number of ignorant individuals. So maybe he was a Remainer after all, but let's leave that aside. So the multiplier depends upon the dominant narrative which emerges when there's a major change in fiscal policy. And it's that which has been elusive to capture until very recently. Because new tools, big data, major advances in machine learning algorithms means that it's possible to track the network of sentiment and to see the nodes which should be targeted or the topics which are being discussed, what traction they're getting. Let me just give an illustration of this. It's been used very effectively by Trump and the alt-right. They understand how cyber society works. So how do you manipulate Google's PageRank algorithm? there's big arguments about at the moment. Some group has succeeded in getting to the question, are Jews evil? Some very right-wing site comes up number 1. How do you manipulate Google's page rank algorithm? Well, first of all, you construct the network in cyberspace around which the topic is being discussed. You form the adjacency matrix of the graph, and you calculate its principal eigenvector. And that just starts you off. Then it gets hard. Then you have to battle and game Google's mathematicians. And it's a really, really hard problem. But despite their veneer of stupidity and anti-expert nature, the New Right have been much smarter in understanding cyber society than their metropolitan liberal opponents, most of whom, I should say, in a gratuitous insult, have either read arts or PPE. So, it's appropriate to say this in a Keynesian context. But it is possible now, maybe, to action the multiplier in a way which wasn't possible. But I'm very sceptical about what value the multiplier's had in the last 80 years. We don't know its value. We can't predict in advance whether a recession's coming. So what use has it been? But maybe now, with new science, with new algorithms, with big data, maybe finally Keynes was interested in advanced mathematics, and maybe we can finally operationalise the multiplier. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much indeed. Now we're going to try and stick to the timetable, and I think we've got time for maybe 2 sharp questions, comments, because we're going to have a panel discussion, and there'll be a lot of opportunity, I hope, for interaction at that point as we move on. So 2 sharp, quick comments to both of them. Any takers? Gentleman there. Just say your name and who you're from.
Oh, sorry, thank you,
Yeah.
Mike. Mike Howell from a company called Cross Border Capital. In your little document you gave me as I came in, it says that sort of point number 2 is that one of the traits of Keynes was his rejection of monetary policy. And I think that's something that stands out very clearly from a lot of the debate in the 1930s. But it's kind of been absent in the narrative so far. And one of the things is the Bank of England and other central banks worldwide have sort of taken the reins of control after the financial crisis, and maybe in some ways understandably. But basically, we need to take the reins from them and start looking more at planning and fiscal policy and whatever. Every big company doesn't really forecast, they plan. And that's going to be what we've got to think about in the context of the future and maybe an infrastructure program.
Very good. Another question? Gentleman right on the far left there.
John Alexander from a software company. You said Keynes understood the markets better than any economist. That was before OTC derivatives caused a disconnect between the finance sector and real economies. What would you think of the markets now?
We will be so good at asking quick questions. We're going to have, I think, 2 more nice and quick ones. Gentleman there.
Just on, Jeremy Beck with Unemployed. Just on animal spirits, the average return equity globally is 15%, so profits are pretty high, and long-term interest rates are near as low as they've ever been. So there really does seem to be an issue here with global animal spirits. And I just wondered what else can be done to boost that.
Are you happy if I take one more before we... David Smith. Just say, David Smith.
David Smith speaking, economic forecasting. When Keynes published the general theory, we're about halfway through, half a dozen years of 40% real growth, one of the biggest expansions in UK history. What's he thinking of the British economy, the American economy, of the time he wrote it?
Very good. Nick, why don't you kick off as you...
Yeah, let's start with my favourite subject, the Bank of England. I do think the Bank of England and indeed central banks generally have been far more imaginative than Montague Norman was in the 1920s, 1930s. Keynes actually did get on the court of the Bank of England at the very end of his life, and he wrote to a friend, same old Monty, always so charming, always so wrong. You know, where I think modern central banks have learned is they have recognised the importance of liquidity, and they've recognised the importance of the monetary transmission mechanism and seeking through interventions like the I can't remember his name. Anyway, there's some credit scheme which actually been quite FLS. What's that stand for? Funding for lending. Very good. So now the issue is actually have they gone too far? Have all those central bankers sitting in Basel concluded that only they really know the answer? And I do worry about the extent of quantitative easing and the difficulties of unwinding this extraordinarily loose monetary policy. And it's almost, I mean, I have this sort of theory that in the old days there were two institutions you could rely on, the Bank of England and the IMF. And I mean, if you were a subscriber to Treasury orthodoxy, that was.
You can say no.
Exactly,
Yeah,
yes. And actually they've changed sides and become great advocates of Keynesianism, which may be a good thing. But I think you're right to worry about it. I think whether we should do more planning. I mean, I totally agree. Companies need to plan. Governments need to plan. What would worry me is when that planning turns into slightly Soviet-style planning, or like the national plan in the 1960s. I just don't think. Look, the aggregation of corporate plans, I think, can be quite efficient because it reflects a degree of diffusion amongst private agents. Governments have an extraordinary tendency to get things wrong, and it may just be that having worked there for 30 years, I don't really have much confidence in the government machine. Other point, the point about derivatives, look, in many ways we always think things have changed, but in many ways they remain the same. If you go back to the Macmillan report, the City of London has always been this extraordinary successful centre of capital transactions, but the extraordinary inability of all that finance to impact on SMEs in Britain was as true 80 years ago as it is today. So I wouldn't argue that it's got a whole lot worse, but I think it is one of those paradoxes about Britain is the disconnect between financial services and real economic activity. The problem for the Treasury latterly is just there are so many people in the City of London who are generating very important revenue that we all rather miss the fact, we miss them because there is now a massive hole in the public finances. I think this is the point when I should hand over to Paul to answer the other two questions, because I'm in danger of forgetting what they were.
I can say, in terms of would Keynes have understood markets now? Would Bradman have averaged 99 in current modern test conditions? I don't know. I don't know is the answer. Probably not, which is the answer to your point there. Probably not. It's much more difficult now. But coming back to the 2 points on, Davies raised the question, what was Keynes right about when the economy was booming and the animal spirits one. So I think, going back to the supply side, why was the economy booming? Because the Treasury did have a policy. And one of the policies was to encourage the formation of domestic oligopolies so they could raise prices and raise profit margins. On the rising profit share, private investment was booming, and that's why the economy was recovering. It was a supply side one. So I think the general theory is essentially was 4 years behind the times in that sense when it was published. But just finally, the question of global animal spirits, I agree that they're depressed in the sense that there's been an underinvestment in innovation and in physical resources. And it links into the way in which financial markets have become dominant. That's where money goes, that's where talent goes, at the expense, except in the United States, of innovation. And so in that sense, animal spirits are low, and it's a major challenge, correcting this imbalance. But that's why I think the recovery since the global crisis as being weak because of relatively weak animal spirits on the private investment side.
Rory, can I just say one very little point on the last one? The thing which really strikes me is two of the most successful British recoveries started in 1931 and in about 1992. And both of them consisted of a massive devaluation and a very tight fiscal policy. And you know, I think there's a lesson there. You know, when you devalue, that really encourages demand. But it's at times like that you've really got to keep the fiscal deficit tight, and that should sustain a recovery.
Can I thank you both very much indeed for taking it off so neatly, and also, if I may say so, for balancing the agenda. When we were trying to put this together, I wanted to make sure that Keynes was treated in a fair way by people who were sympathetic and warm towards what he achieved with the general theory and the Keynesian tradition that went with it. At the same time, I wanted a little bit of grit in the oyster and a slightly sharp pinching of why saying no sometimes is a good idea. Some of the people who might have helped us couldn't join us today. Either they got flu, they're dealing with grandchildren. Dealing with grandchildren is becoming a very big issue, I might add. Or they're planning next year's teaching. But I think you've actually managed to tee up us very, very nicely for the panel who's going to come and join us right now to answer all our questions. So thank you both very much indeed. And that was a gem of a story from both of you.